She banned me from the birthday party I just handed over $5,000 for, telling me my flannel shirts and calloused hands would ruin the aesthetic of her elite social circle. My daughter-in-law saw the sawdust in my hair and saw a human ATM she could discard. She didn't realize that a man who spends 40 years building structures knows exactly which load-bearing beam to pull to bring the whole house down. If you're reading this, subscribe to the channel and let me know where in the world you're watching from. It helps to know that in a world of optics, there are still people who value the truth. Taking inspiration from Inspiration 3, I realize that I don't just build legacies, I'm perfectly capable of demolishing them when the foundation is rotted through. Let me back up and tell you how 40 years of honest labor and a grandfather's love led to a Tuesday morning where I finally had to become the wrecking ball for my own bloodline. My name is Arthur. I build things. That is the singular, immutable truth of my existence. For 40 years, I ran Vance & Sons Construction, a name etched into the cornerstones of half the libraries and town halls in this county. I've spent my life reading the language of structures, the way a beam sighs under a heavy snow load, the way a settling foundation groans in the middle of a July heat wave. I know, with a certainty that lives in my marrow, that a house is only as strong as its footprint. If the concrete is poured on unstable soil, the walls will eventually map out their own demise in jagged cracks. If the wood is infected with rot, the roof will succumb to gravity, slow and indifferent. People, I've learned too late, follow the same laws of physics. And my family? The foundation wasn't just cracking. It was turning to sand beneath my feet. I just chose to look at the sunset instead of the basement floor. I sat in my armchair and looked at my hands. They were a topography of a hard life. Calluses covered my palms like organic armor, thick enough that I could pick up a hot coal without flinching. There was the jagged white lightning of a scar on my thumb from a table saw in '88 that nearly took the digit. There was the dull, constant throb in my left knee, a souvenir from a 20-foot scaffold fall in '98. To the people I passed in the grocery store, these were just signs of age, or worse, dirt. They saw the sawdust in the creases of my neck and the oil under my fingernails, and saw a man who had failed to climb the social ladder. They never saw the strength beneath the dust. They didn't understand that these marks were my ledger. Proof of work, proof of a life lived in the service of stability. But as I sat in the silence of my living room, I realized that while I could shore up a skyscraper, I had no tools for the rot growing in my own bloodline. Pop, pop, look, it's ready for the lift test. Leo's voice was a sudden, sharp chord that cut through the oppressive quiet of the garage. He was 7 years old, a small, vibrant creature who seemed to radiate a light the rest of us had lost. Since my Mary passed 3 years ago, the silence in this house had become a physical presence, a heavy, velvet shroud that muffled the heartbeat of the rooms. But when Leo was here, the shroud vanished. The silence didn't just break, it ran away, terrified of his laughter. He stood by the workbench, his small chest puffed out with a pride I recognized. He held up a balsa wood wing, the delicate ribs of the frame visible through the thin paper. Glue dripped from his thumb, a sticky testament to his effort. "I see it, buddy," I said, my voice rasping from disuse. I leaned over the bench, inhaling the scent of wood shavings and Elmer's glue, the smell of potential. We were building a Selpwith camel model. He had Mary's eyes. Hazel, soft, yet possessing an intelligence that felt older than his 7 years. He held the glue bottle with 2 hands, his tongue poking out the corner of his mouth in a display of absolute, unadulterated focus. He was careful. He didn't rush the joints. He respected the work, even the boring parts like sanding the edges of the fuselage. He was a good boy, honest and sturdy. But as I watched him, a cold stone of dread settled in my stomach. He was a thoroughbred being raised by wolves, and I wondered how long it would take for them to teach him how to bite. My son, David, is not a villain. He is a good man, in the way a soft piece of pine is good for a decorative trim, but useless for a load-bearing stud. He has a heart of gold, perhaps, but a spine made of wet putty. He's spent his life trying to please people who don't like him. 6 years ago, he married Jessica, and I watched the light in him begin to dim, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. Jessica is a woman who lives in a world of optics. She doesn't care if a chair is comfortable. She cares if it's the right brand to be seen in. She looks at my flannel shirts and my 2015 Ford truck, as if they are infectious diseases that might ruin her social standing. When she enters a room, the temperature seems to drop 10 degrees, not because she's cold, but because she's constantly calculating the value of everyone in it. Jessica tolerates me with the practiced patience of a museum curator dealing with a dusty relic. She smiles when I open my checkbook, a tight, predatory thinning of the lips, but she winces when she sees my truck in her driveway. It has dust on the bumper and a dent in the tailgate from a load of gravel. To her, it's an eyesore that lowers the property value of her ego. To me, it's a machine that has never failed to start in a blizzard. Reliability, I've found, doesn't get likes on social media. It doesn't have a designer logo. But I could live with her vanity. I could live with her looking down her nose at my calluses. What I couldn't live with was the realization that her hunger was starting to outpace my son's ability to provide. And then there is Veronica, Jessica's mother. If Jessica's a shark, Veronica is the pilot fish that thinks it's the shark. She wears jewelry she clearly cannot afford, gaudy, heavy pieces that rattle when she moves, and speaks with a mid-Atlantic accent. She certainly wasn't born with in the suburbs of Ohio. She looks at me like I am the hired help, someone who should be entering through the service door. I never minded the slights. I am a simple man with simple needs, and I long ago stopped seeking the approval of people I wouldn't trust to hold a level. But I had underestimated the depth of their desperation. I didn't know how far they would go to maintain the facade of a life they hadn't earned. The storm arrived on a Tuesday in October. It wasn't a cleansing rain. It was a cold, gray drizzle that tapped against the living room glass like the nervous fingers of a debtor. I was sitting in my armchair, the evening paper unread in my lap, listening to the house creak. Suddenly, twin beams of light cut through the gloom, sweeping across the peeling wallpaper of the hallway. Headlights in the driveway. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. They never came on Tuesdays. Tuesday was a school night. Tuesday was for routine. A visit on a Tuesday meant the foundation had shifted, and someone was coming to tell me the walls were falling in. The front door opened, bringing in a gust of wet autumnal air. David walked in first, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to occupy as little space as possible. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floorboards, his fingers frantically twisting his wedding ring. He'd done that since he was 5 years old. The guilt twitch. He did it before confessing he'd broken a window or failed a math test. Jessica followed a few steps behind, shedding her designer raincoat like a snake's skin. She was smiling, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were hard and blue, scanning the room for a target. A shark smiles before it bites, they say, and Jessica was showing a lot of teeth. "Arthur," she exclaimed, her voice a pitch too high, echoing uncomfortably in the quiet house. She glided over and pressed her cheek against mine. Her perfume was overwhelming, a sharp chemical floral scent that smelled like a department store's expensive floor. It was meant to mask something, though I couldn't say what yet. "Where is Leo?" I asked, my voice flat. I didn't return the hug. "Oh, he's at home with the sitter," she said, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "We wanted some, adult time. Red flag number 1. They never left Leo behind if they could help it. He was their shield, the buffer that kept me from asking the hard questions. If the boy wasn't here, it meant they were hunting for something big. We sat at the kitchen table, the heart of the home, where I used to go over blueprints with Mary. The rain drummed harder now, a rhythmic thumping that felt like a ticking clock. "Arthur," Jessica started leaning forward so the light caught the fake sparkle in her earrings. "We have a situation, a wonderful but admittedly stressful situation." She flashed that smile again, the one she'd clearly practiced in a mirror until the muscle memory was perfect. "Is Leo okay?" I asked again. My heart skipped a beat, a momentary odor of genuine panic. "He's perfect, Arthur." "Better than perfect," she said, but her eyes remained cold, calculating the distance between my sympathy and my wallet. "But his birthday is coming up," she continued, her voice dropping into a tone of manufactured concern. "The big 07, and you know he's struggling a bit at the private academy. The other children, Arthur, they can be quite cruel. It's all about status at that age. I thought of Leo's hazel eyes, the way they lit up over a piece of balsa wood. I didn't think he gave a damn about status. So they have these lavish parties," she whispered, leaning closer. "Pony rides, catering, magicians. We want to put Leo on the map. We want to give him a confidence booster, so he isn't the poor kid anymore. I nodded slowly. I had seen the bruises on his shins, the way he sometimes went quiet when David talked about the other dad's sports cars. I wanted him to be happy. They knew exactly which lever to pull. What did you have in mind? I asked. David finally spoke, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. His voice was quiet, sounding like a script he'd been forced to memorize under duress. We found a venue, Dad, the Grandview Estate. You know, the one on the hill. I raised an eyebrow. The Grandview? That place was a fortress of marble and gold leaf. It was where the tech giants held their galas and the old money families had their 5-course weddings. It wasn't a place for a 7-year-old's birthday. It was a place for people who wanted to pretend they were royalty. David, I said, my voice heavy with the builder's pragmatism, that place charges a fortune just to unlock the heavy iron gates. You could build a small house for what they charge for a weekend. It's an investment in his future, Jessica cut in, her voice sharpening. She looked at me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Here is the problem, Arthur. The deposit, the high-end catering, the live entertainment. It's $5,000 up front. And frankly, with the kitchen renovations we're doing, we just don't have that kind of liquidity right now. Renovations. I knew their kitchen was fine. I'd seen it. This wasn't about liquidity. It was about a transfer of wealth from my past to her present. $5,000. For a single afternoon of cake and balloons. I looked at my son. Outer looked miserable. A man being crushed by a load he wasn't built to carry. He stared at his scuffed shoes, his face a mask of shame. Then I looked at Jessica. She didn't look ashamed. She looked hungry. Not for food, but for the social currency that $5,000 check represented. She wasn't asking for a loan. She was hungry. She saw me as a resource to be mined, a pile of old lumber that still had some value if you stripped the paint. I will pay it, I said. The words felt like lead in the air. Jessica's eyes lit up instantly, a frantic, glittering joy that reminded me of a slot machine hitting the jackpot. But, I added, and her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. On one condition. Anything, Arthur. Truly. I want to help plan. I want to build the decorations with Leo in the workshop. I want to be involved in the details. I don't want to just be the bank. I don't want to just write a check and show up for a photo. I continued, my voice firming. I want to be his grandfather. I want to see the joy on his face when he sees what we built together. Of course. Jessica clapped her hands, the sound like a gunshot in the small kitchen. You are the guest of honor, Arthur. You're the hero. My mother, Veronica, is coming to help with the aesthetic side. But you're the foundation of this family. Words. They were just pretty, hollow words, sanded down to remove the sharp edges. But in that moment, looking at David's relieved face, I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe the rot hadn't reached the core. I walked over to my heavy oak desk, the one where I had signed the contracts for the Valley's first hospital and the high school gym. I pulled out the checkbook, the leather cover worn smooth by decades of use. I wrote the numbers with a steady hand. $5,000. The ink looked stark and black against the pale blue paper. It felt like a lot of money. Not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. 2 months of hard-earned pension, given away for a lie. I thought I was buying a memory for Leo. In reality, I was paying for my own betrayal. I tore the check out with a crisp zip. I didn't hand it to Jessica, despite her reaching hand. I handed it to David. Make sure he has a good day, son, I said, my voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a warning I hoped he'd hear. That is the only thing that matters. Not the optics. The boy. We will, Dad, David said. He stood up and hugged me. It was a brief, desperate embrace. He smelled of sweat and anxiety. For a second, I felt the boy he used to be. But then he pulled away, and the man he'd become took over. They left quickly, citing the rain and the busy schedule of a birthday planner. I stood at the window, the curtain pulled back just an inch, watching them walk to their car. Before they even reached the passenger door, I saw Jessica snatch the check out of David's hand. She held it up to the yellow glow of the streetlight, inspecting it with the intensity of a diamond merchant. She said something to David. Something sharp, judging by the way he flinched, and then she tucked the paper into her expensive handbag. A cold, heavy feeling settled in my gut. It felt like wet cement being poured into a hole it was never meant to fill. I had seen the look on her face. It wasn't gratitude, it was triumph. The real betrayal was still waiting in the shadows, and I was the one who had just handed them the keys. 3 days passed, and the silence in my house became a deafening weight. Every time the floorboard creaked, I checked my phone. Nothing. No thank you text. No invitation to the venue walkthrough. Just the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfathered clock in the hall. I retreated to my sanctuary, the workshop. It was a space that smelled of cedar, old oil, and 40 years of honest labor. I found several sheets of cabinet-grade birch plywood, the expensive stuff with a grain as smooth as silk. I spent hours at my drafting table sketching the blueprints for a collapsible castle facade. Leo loved the Middle Ages. I imagined him running through the gates, his face glowing under the Grandview's chandeliers. I was ready to build. I had the tools, the materials, and a grandfather's love, which is a fuel more potent than any gasoline. But as the sun dipped below the horizon for the third time, the phone remained a cold, black slab on the workbench. On Friday, I couldn't take the dullness anymore. I wiped the sawdust from my hands and dialed David's number. It rang 4 times long, lonely tones, before he picked up. "Hey, son. I've got the primary supports for the castle towers cut. I thought I'd swing by this evening and show you the designs. When is a good time for me to come over?" There was a long, hollow silence on the other end. I could hear the sound of a television in the background, and a nervous, jagged cough that made my skin crawl. Hey, Dad, David started, his voice sounding thin, like a wire stretched too tight. "Listen, about the decorations." Actually, David continued, his words tripping over each other in a frantic rush. "Jessica, she went ahead and hired a professional event planner, a specialist. They handle everything from the tablecloths to the visual architecture of the room." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles popped. "David, I'm a structural builder. I've built town halls. I think I can handle a cardboard castle and some balsa wood." "I know, Dad. I know you can," he said, sounding like he was on the verge of a breakdown. "But Jessica is worried about your back and your knee. She doesn't want you straining yourself on a ladder in that big ballroom. She just wants you to relax. Just show up on the day and enjoy being a guest. Okay? It's not a strain, David. It's a gift," I said, but the line was already buzzing with a dial tone. He had hung up before I could argue. I stood in the workshop, surrounded by the smell of fresh-cut birch, and felt the first true sting of rejection. My back, my knee. Jessica had never asked about my health in 6 years, unless it was to ask if I'd updated my will. This wasn't about my physical limitations. It was about my aesthetic. She didn't want the old man in his work boots clambering around her high society party. She wanted a sanitized version of a grandfather, one who stayed in his seat and kept his mouth shut. I looked at the plywood towers. They looked foolish now. I felt a surge of hot, bitter shame, but I forced it down. I wouldn't let her win. If I couldn't build the world, I would at least provide the treasure. A week before the party, I decided to take matters into my own hand. I couldn't help with the optics, but I could be the grandfather Leo deserved. I went to the high-end toy store downtown. I bypassed the action figures and the plastic swords. I went straight for the heavy hitters. I bought the largest Lego set they had, the Ultimate Collector Series Death Star, 4,000 pieces, a masterpiece of plastic engineering. It cost $400, nearly a week's worth of my pension. But as I hauled the massive box to the counter, all I could think about was Leo's hazel eyes. This wasn't just a toy. It was a project. It was something we would build together, brick by brick, over the winter months. It was a bridge back to him. I spent 3 hours wrapping that box. I didn't use the shiny, colorful paper from the supermarket. I went to my office and pulled out a roll of heavy-duty vellum that looked like architectural blueprints. I used a drafting pen to draw little gears and pulleys in the corners. I wanted him to know that this gift came from a builder. I wanted it to be heavy and substantial. I planned to drop it off a few days early so I wouldn't have to navigate the crowded party with such a bulky item. I drove to their house on a sunny afternoon, the box buckled into the passenger seat like a silent companion. The air was crisp, but the storm was no longer outside. It had moved into my chest. I pulled into their driveway and my heart sank. Jessica's SUV was parked at a crooked angle, and next to it sat a sleek, silver Mercedes. Veronica. I sighed, leaning my head against the steering wheel. I didn't have the energy for her mid-Atlantic condescension today. I almost put the truck in reverse and left, but the weight of the Lego set reminded me of my mission. I was there for Leo. I would walk in, leave the gift, and be gone before Veronica could finish her first glass of afternoon Chardonnay. Or so I thought. I walked up the stone path. The heavy box balanced against my hip. Autumn air was still, which is why the voices carried so clearly through the partially open bay window of the dining room. I stopped 10 feet from the porch. I heard laughter. It wasn't the warm, inclusive laughter of a family. It was high-pitched, sharp, and cruel. The sound of two predators sharing a joke at someone else's expense. My boots felt like they were made of lead. I stood perfectly still, a statue in the shadows of the overgrown hedge. It is going to be absolutely fabulous, darling. Veronica's voice drifted out, sounding more theatrical than usual. The school board members will be green with envy. And those diamonds, they look truly exquisite on you. They catch the light perfectly. Diamond. My pulse began to thrum, and my ears. Jessica hadn't mentioned diamonds. She'd mentioned liquidity issues and renovations. I know, Jessica replied, her voice buzzing with a cold, triumphant energy. But what about him? I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. I knew exactly who him was. Don't worry, Mom, Jessica said, her tone sharpening like a whetstone. I am handling it. He's so easy to manage. He thinks he's helping by writing the checks. He actually believes he's part of the plan. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked down at the blueprint-wrapped box in my arms. But I'll just tell him the time changed at the last minute, Jessica continued. Or I'll tell him there was a mix-up with the guest list. Anything to keep him away from the actual event. I simply cannot have him there in those dreadful flannel shirts. Jessica's voice rose in a mock shudder. Walking around, smelling like sawdust and talking about lumber and load-bearing walls. We are trying to impress the elite, not the labor union. It's embarrassing, honestly. Good, Veronica chirped. This is my grandson's debut into the right circles. I want to be the grandmother they remember, the wealthy, sophisticated one, not the one connected to a mechanic. Mechanic, the word hit me like a physical blow. I had owned a firm that shaped the skyline of this county. I had employed 50 families, paid for their health insurance, and built the very library where Veronica probably pretended to read. To them, I was just dirty money. A convenient ATM that came wrapped in a flannel shirt they found offensive. I wasn't a person. I was a resource to be harvested, and then discarded before the real people arrived. My heart hammered against my ribs. A wild, panicked bird. Part of me wanted to kick the door down and roar until the windows shattered. But I am a man of discipline. I've spent 40 years calculating tolerances and measuring twice before cutting. Rage is a fire. If you let it loose in a wooden house, it burns everything to the ground, including the things you love. I didn't scream. I didn't knock. I turned around with the silence of a ghost. I carried the heavy box, the bridge that would never be built, back to my truck. I placed it in the passenger seat and closed the door with a soft, final click. My world had just tilted on its axis, and the foundation was officially gone. My knuckles were white as bone on the steering wheel. They were going to cut me out. They had taken my $5,000, money I had worked decades to save, and now they were erasing my name from my grandson's life. I didn't drive home. I didn't go to the workshop. I drove straight toward the hill, toward the Grandview estate. I needed to see what $5,000 of my blood and sweat had bought. I needed to see the visual architecture that was more important than a grandfather's presence. But as the iron gates loomed ahead, I had a feeling the cracks in their story were about to become a canyon. The Grandview estate sat atop the highest ridge in the county like a crown made of spite. It was a neoclassical monstrosity of white stone, towering pillars, and wrought iron gates that looked designed to keep out anyone who didn't have a 7-figure portfolio. As I pulled my dusty Ford up to the perimeter, the truck felt like a blemish on the landscape. I got out, the gravel crunching under my boots with a sound like grinding teeth. The air up here was thinner, colder. I walked toward the main administration wing, my eyes scanning the architecture. I couldn't help it. I was looking for stress points, for the way the weight was distributed. It was a beautiful structure, but it felt hollow, all facade, no soul. Near the side entrance where the service vehicles usually parked, a man was meticulously trimming the boxwood hedges. He was hunched over, his movements slow and deliberate. As I approached, he straightened up, wiping sweat from a brow that had seen too many summers. I stopped. I knew that posture. I knew those shoulders. "Marcus?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the wind. He squinted at me, his eyes hidden behind thick, scratched safety glasses. Then a slow grin spread across his face, a road map of wrinkles forming around his mouth. "Arthur? Arthur Vance? Well, I'll be damned." It was Marcus Thorne. He had laid every brick on the West Side Library project back in '05. He was a master mason, the kind of man who could tell if a wall was plumbed just by looking at it. He was older now, his hair a shock of white wool, but his grip when he took my hand was still like a bench vise. "Good to see you, boss," Marcus smiled, though his eyes were curious. "What brings a retired legend like you up to the ivory tower? Looking for a consulting gig?" "Not quite, Marcus," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "My grandson's birthday, next Saturday. The Miller party." My daughter-in-law said it was the main ballroom. Marcus's smile didn't just fade, it vanished. He took off his sweat-stained cap and scratched his head, looking toward the grand windows of the main hall. "Next Saturday?" he asked, his voice dropping into a register of confusion. "Yes, the 21st. Big event. 5-star catering." "The works." Marcus shook his head slowly, the movement heavy with a truth I wasn't ready to hear. "Arthur, the ballroom has been est for 3 weeks. We've got scaffolding up from the floor to the ceiling. We're stripping the gold leaf and fixing a structural leak in the roof. There hasn't been an event in there since September, and there won't be one for another month." My stomach dropped, a sensation like falling through a rotted floorboard. "Are you sure, Marcus? Maybe they have another room, a smaller wing. I'm the one painting the trim. Arthur, I'm here 12 hours a day." He pulled a crumpled clipboard from the back of his utility cart. "Let me check the master schedule. Maybe I missed something on the lawn." He flipped through the pages, the paper fluttering in the cold breeze. I watched his finger scan the lines, moving past dates and names that meant nothing to me. I felt like I was watching a countdown. "I have a corporate retreat on the 28th, Marcus muttered, his fingers stopping near the bottom of the page. "And I've got a wedding rehearsal for the 25th out on the patio." He looked up at me, and for the first time in 20 years, I saw pity in his eyes. It was a look I hated. "There is no Miller party, Arthur. Not on Saturday, not next month. The whole place is a construction zone." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of a $5,000 lie hitting the ground. I had known, deep down, but hearing it from a man like Marcus, a man of levels and plumb lines, made it official. I wasn't a guest of honor. I was a "Thanks, Marcus," I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "Everything okay, boss?" he asked, stepping closer. "You look a little gray." "No," I said, straightening my back, feeling the old steel return to my spine. "No, everything is not okay, but it's about to be clear." I turned and walked back to my truck. I didn't look back. If the party wasn't at the Grandview, where was my $5,000? Where was the visual architecture Jessica had been so concerned about? I climbed into the cab, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I needed more data. I needed to map the extent of the route. I pulled over into a gas station parking lot and took out my phone. My hands were steady now, the clinical steadiness of a man about to perform a demolition. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Sam. Sam ran Elite Eats, the catering company that handled every major event in the valley. If there was a party happening, Sam's kitchen was the heart of it. "Sam, it's Arthur Vance." "Arthur, the man, the myth." "It's been ages." You calling to tell me you're finally building that outdoor kitchen you promised me? Not today, Sam, I said, cutting through the pleasantries. I need a favor. Professional courtesy. I need to know if you have an order for Jessica Miller for next Saturday. I heard the familiar clicking of keys over the line. Sam was a businessman. He kept his records like I kept my blueprints. Miller? Let's see. Nothing for the Grandview, Sam said, his voice echoing. Wait, I do have a Miller here, but it's not a gala order. It's a drop-off. Where to? I asked, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. The downtown community center, Sam said, and I could practically hear him shrugging. The small hall, the rec room next to the public pool. You know, the one with the linoleum floors and the smell of chlorine. My heart gave a painful thud. What's the order, Sam? Give me the details. It's the budget birthday package. 6 large pizzas, 3 cases of generic soda, and a half-sheet cake with blue frosting. Paper plates included. How much, Sam? What's the total invoice? With the delivery fee and the weekend surcharge. $450 even. I closed my eyes. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. $5,000 given. $450 spent. Where was the rest? Where was the $4,550? It hadn't gone to the Grandview. It hadn't gone to the visual architecture. It had vanished into Jessica's pockets. Sam, I said, my voice vibrating with a cold fury, I need you to email me that invoice. Right now. Sure thing, Arthur. Is there a problem? Did she say it was more just a misunderstanding, Sam? I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Thanks for the help. I hung up and sat in the dark cab of the truck. Lies. They were piled so high I couldn't see the sky anymore. They had stolen from me, but more importantly, they had stolen the birthday Leo deserved. I drove to the Valley National Bank. It was a building I had helped renovate in the 90s. I knew the height of the ceilings and the thickness of the vault doors. I walked in, the air conditioning hitting me like a wall of ice. I didn't go to the tellers. I walked straight to the manager's row. Mrs. Gable, the woman I'd banked with for 30 years, was out. In her chair sat a young woman with sharp glasses and a professional, guarded expression. Elena, can I help you, sir? She asked, her voice neutral. I'm Arthur Vance. I've had my personal and business accounts here since before you were born. Yes, Mr. Vance. I recognize the name, she said, her posture softening slightly. How can I help you today? I need to see the digital image of a check I wrote last Tuesday. Number 42, for $5,000. One moment she began to type, the rhythmic clack-clack of the keys sounding like a firing squad in the quiet office. The screen flickered, casting a blue light over her face. Here it is, Elena said, turning the monitor slightly so I could see. It cleared 48 hours ago. I leaned in. There it was, my signature, my handwriting, and on the back, in a loopy, arrogant script for deposit only, Jessica Miller. Did that go into the joint account she holds with my son, David? I asked. Elena hesitated, her eyes darting to the bank's privacy policy posted on the wall. I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. I can't discuss the details of accounts where you aren't a named signer. Eleni, I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. My son's business account is linked to my primary as a guarantor. I am a signer on his secondary Miller family account for emergencies. You know that. Check the records. She typed again, her brow furrowed. You're right, my apologies. Let me look. No, she paused, her frown deepening. It wasn't deposited into the joint account. It was a mobile deposit, Elena whispered, as if the walls were listening, into a private, personal checking account. Sole owner, Jessica Miller. It was moved into a high-yield savings sub-account immediately after clearing. I felt a pulse of heat in my neck. She hadn't even given David access to the money. She was hoarding it like a dragon. Elena added, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Vance, there's something else. Something flagged by our security department yesterday morning. What? I asked. I felt like I was bracing for a final crushing blow. There was a hard eerie on your personal credit report yesterday afternoon, she said, looking at me with genuine concern. An application for a senior care assistance loan. For $50,000. I felt the air leave my lungs. I didn't apply for any loan. I don't need senior care. I know, Elena said quickly. The application was denied because you have a fraud alert on your file from that data breach last year. But, Elena continued, the contact email and phone number listed on the application, they match the depositor of that $5,000 check. J. Miller 7. My heart didn't just break. It turned to stone. This wasn't just a scam for a party. This was an attempt to leverage my entire life's work. They were trying to borrow against my future to pay for their present. They were trying to put me in a home with my own money. This is war, I whispered. Print it, I said, my voice sounding like grinding stone. Mr. Vance? Print the inquiry. Print the check image. Front and back. Print the timestamps of the mobile deposit. I want everything. Elena didn't argue. She saw the look in my eyes, the look of a man who was no longer building but demolishing a structure that had become a hazard to the public. I walked out of the bank 10 minutes later, clutching a thick manila folder. The afternoon sun was blinding, reflecting off the glass of the storefronts, but I felt like I was walking through a blizzard. I felt physically ill, a churning knot of nausea in my gut, but beneath the sickness was a cold, crystalline focus. I had the blueprints of their betrayal. I knew exactly where the rot was, and I knew how deep it went. Now, I just needed to find out why they were so desperate. I needed to see the jewelry. I needed to see the woman behind the curtain. I sat in the cab of my truck, the manila folder resting on the passenger seat like a live explosive. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, skeletal shadows across the bank's parking lot. My breathing was shallow. In the world of construction, you don't just look at the crack. You look for the subsidence, the shifting earth that caused it. I picked up my phone and dialed Robert. Robert had been my attorney for 32 years. He was a man who navigated the law with the cold precision of a surgeon and the tenacity of a shark. He didn't do emotions, he did statutes. Robert, I said when he picked up, I need a deep dive. I need it yesterday. Arthur, you sound like you're standing over a collapsed bridge. Robert's voice was gravelly, seasoned by decades of litigation. Worse, I replied, I'm standing over a collapsed family. I need a full financial workup on Veronica Vance, my daughter-in-law's mother. Liens, credit scores, court records, everything. A mother-in-law? That's a sharp turn, Arthur. What's the angle? Just follow the scent of my $5,000, Robert. I have a feeling it's buried in her backyard. Give me an hour, I'll tap the databases. I sat in the stillness watching the world move past. A young couple walked by, laughing. The man carrying a bag of groceries, the woman holding his arm. I felt like a ghost watching the living. My life had been built on the idea of permanence, stone, steel, and blood. But as I sat there, I realized that blood is the most volatile material of all. I thought about the years I spent building Vance & Sons. The 5,000 a.m. starts in the freezing rain, the bone-deep exhaustion. I did it all so David wouldn't have to carry the same heavy loads I did. I thought I was giving him a foundation. Instead, I had given him a porch he didn't know how to maintain, and he had let the termites in. My phone buzzed. It was a PDF from Robert, followed immediately by a call. Arthur, Robert said, his voice stripped of its usual bravado, you were right to look. It's a catastrophe, a total structural failure. Tell me, Veronica is functionally bankrupt. She has 3 separate liens against her condo for unpaid property taxes. Her credit cards, all 6 of them, are maxed out to the penny. We're talking over $80,000 in high-interest debt. And the why, Robert? People don't just disappear that kind of money on groceries. Gambling, Arthur, mostly high-stakes digital poker and weekend trips to the riverboat casinos. But there's a darker layer. There are a few civil judgments from some unconventional lenders. Private collectors, the kind of people who don't send letters, they send visitors. It clicked, the visual architecture, the social standing. It wasn't just vanity, it was a desperate, panicked scramble to keep the debt collectors at bay. Jessica wasn't just being greedy. She was funneling my life's work into the black hole of her mother's addiction. One more thing, Robert added, the sound of paper rustling over the line. I have a contact at Lux Jewelers downtown. You know the place? The one with the armed guard at the door? I know it. A Jessica Miller made a high-value purchase there yesterday afternoon. A diamond tennis bracelet. Total after tax, $4,020. Paid via debit card from a personal account. The numbers echoed in my head like a hammer hitting an anvil. $5,000. The gift, $450. The pizza party, a $45 and $50. She had bought the bracelet with the leftovers. She was wearing my retirement on her wrist while my grandson ate cheap pizza in a damp basement. Robert, I said, my voice as cold as a winter morning in the mountains, I need you to prepare 2 sets of documents. Immediately. I'm listening. First, I want a copy of that receipt and the bank statements we discussed. Second, I want an eviction notice. Eviction? Robert paused. For who? Arthur? You don't own the house they live in, do you? I own the property on Elm Street, I said. The rental they've been paying me for at half-market rate for 5 years. The one where I haven't cashed their check in 6 months because David said they were struggling. Arthur, that's your son. Robert's voice was uncharacteristically soft. If you kick them out, they have nowhere to go. Not with Jessica's credit and Veronica's debts. He isn't my son right now, I said, looking at my scarred, rough hands in the dashboard light. He is a co-conspirator. He is an accomplice to the theft of his own son's future. Have the papers ready by tomorrow. I'm going to the party. God help them, Robert whispered. God has nothing to do with this. I replied, this is physics. You remove the support, the roof falls. I hung up and sat in the dark. The folder was no longer just a collection of papers. It was a demolition charge. I had every piece of evidence. The fake venue, the cheap hall, the stolen identity, the jewelry, and the gambling debts. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 6:00 p.m. I had one last thing to do before the party on Saturday. I had to give David a chance to save himself. A final inspection. I wanted to see if there was any sound timber left in him, or if he was rotted through to the soul. I started the truck. The engines rumble a low growl of intent. I invited David over for dinner on Thursday night. I told him it was just a pre-birthday catch-up, but my kitchen felt like an interrogation room. I spent the afternoon preparing a pot roast. His favorite since he was a boy. I seared the meat in the cast-iron skillet. Mary had used for 40 years, the sizzle sounding like a warning. I added the carrots, the small potatoes, and a sprig of fresh thyme from the window box. Soon, the house was filled with the warm, savory scent of comfort and tradition. It was a smell that usually meant safety, but tonight it felt like bait. I was setting a table for a man I no longer recognized, hoping to find the ghost of the son I once knew. David arrived at 6:30. He looked like a structure under extreme tension. There were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes, and his skin had a gray, sallow tint. He sat at the kitchen table, the same oak table where I'd taught him how to read a tape measure, but he looked like a stranger in his own history. He ate quickly, almost frantically, his fork clattering against the ceramic plate in the quiet room. He wouldn't look at the photos of his mother on the mantel. He wouldn't even look at me. He just shoveled the meat and potatoes into his mouth, as if he were trying to fill a hole that had no bottom. David, I said, my voice steady, cutting through the silence. I leaned back and poured him a glass of water, watching the way his hand shook when he reached for it. Is everything set for the grand view on Saturday? I imagine the logistics for a place that size must be a nightmare. He froze. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth, a piece of carrot trembling on the tines. The clock in the hall ticked once, twice, 3 times. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of the $5,000 sitting in a private account, and the $450 pizza order waiting in a damp reek room. I felt a desperate, irrational hope. Tell me the truth, son. Just tell me you're in over your head. Tell me she took it. I can fix a mistake, but I can't fix a lie. I watched his eyes. They darted toward the door, then toward the floorboards, then finally toward the darkened window. He was searching for an exit, not from the room, but from the truth. In structural engineering, there is a moment right before a beam snaps where the wood groans. I could hear that groan in the way he breathed. This was the final inspection. If he told me the truth now, Dad, we couldn't afford it, Jessica. Move the money. I was too ashamed to tell you. I would have stood up, grabbed my coat, and helped him rebuild. I would have forgiven the debt to save the man. I waited, my heart hammering a slow, painful rhythm against my ribs. David cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. He finally looked at me, but his eyes were glassy, shielded by a layer of practiced deceit. "Yeah, Dad," he said, his voice gaining a false, brittle strength. "It's all set. The grand view. Man, they don't make it easy. The security, the guest lists. It's a lot of red tape." He took a sip of water, his Adam's apple bobbing. "But it's going to be worth it. To see Leo in that ballroom, under those lights, it's exactly what he needs, an investment, like Jessica says." Lays. He had chosen the lie. He had looked at the man who raised him, the man who had worked his fingers to the bone to give him a life, and he had chosen the woman with the diamond bracelet. My heart didn't break loudly. It broke quietly, like a dry twig snapping in a winter forest. The disappointment was a cold, physical weight that settled in my lungs, making it hard to draw a full breath. I realized then that I wasn't looking at my son. I was looking at a hollow shell that had been occupied by someone else's greed. "And Jessica?" I asked, my voice sounding distant, even to my own ears. "Is she happy with how it's coming together?" "She's stressed," David said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "You know how she is. Everything has to be perfect. But she's happy. We're all happy, Dad." He didn't offer to help with the dishes. He didn't ask how my knee was. He just moved toward the door as if he were escaping a fire. "I'll see you Saturday at 1 p.m. then?" "Yeah," I said, my voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I'll see you Saturday." After he left, I stood at the sink. I didn't turn on the dishwasher. I washed every plate by hand, the water scalding hot, almost too hot to bear. I scrubbed the cast-iron skillet with a steel wool pad, the rhythmic shuck-shuck-shuck of the metal against the pan, the only sound in the house. I didn't feel the heat on my skin. I felt numb. My son was gone, replaced by a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a woman who saw people as pawns. I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. I looked old. I looked tired. But as I dried the last plate, I saw the steel in my own eyes. If the foundation was rotted, there was only one thing left to do. You don't patch a collapse. You clear the site and start over. Friday evening arrived with a biting wind that rattled the loose shingles on the workshop roof. I spent the hour after sunset in the kitchen, a tin of black wax and a horsehair brush in front of her. I was polishing my shoes, the heavy leather Oxfords I only wore for funerals and board meetings. I remembered polishing David's shoes when he was a boy, showing him how to work the wax into the creases so the leather wouldn't crack. I had taught him that how a man carries himself starts with how he treats his foundation. Now, as I buffed the leather to a mirror shine, I felt like I was preparing for a different kind of ceremony. I wasn't going to a party. I was going to a forensic investigation of a crime scene. My phone, resting on the scarred wood of the table, buzzed with a sharp, aggressive vibration. I didn't have to look at the ID to know who it was. The notification light blinked, a cold, rhythmic blue. I swiped the screen. It was a text from Jessica, a wall of text, punctuated by emojis that felt like insults. "Arthur, I'm so sorry to do this at the last minute, but I'm going to have to ask you not to come to the party tomorrow. My mother is having a very difficult time emotionally. She's been so fragile lately. She admitted to me that she feels intimidated by your presence. She's worried you'll judge the extravagance of the event. It would just cause such a scene, and we want this day to be purely about Leo's joy. We'll do a private dinner next week, just for us. Thanks for being so understanding." I stared at the screen until the light dimmed and went black. There it was, the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. They hadn't just stolen the money. They were now actively stealing my place in the family. They had taken $5,000 of my life, used it to buy jewelry and pay off gambling debts to collectors, and now they were banning me from seeing my grandson open his gifts because I was an intimidation. Because my flannel shirts and my calloused hands might remind the school board members that the wealthy Millers were built on the back of a man who actually worked for a living. I sat in the dim light of the kitchen, the scent of shoe polish thick in the air. I analyzed her words with the cold eye of a building inspector. She was using her mother's fragility as a structural shield. It was a classic move of a coward, hiding behind a feigned emotional crisis to commit a cold-blooded act of exclusion. She didn't want me there because she knew I would see the linoleum floors of the community center. She knew I would see the $50 rental hall and the $450 pizza order. She knew that if I stood in that room, the entire facade would collapse under the weight of my gaze. She wasn't protecting her mother's feelings. She was protecting her own lies. My thumbs hovered over the glass. I could have called her. I could have screamed. I could have told her I knew about the Grandview, the banking query, and the diamond bracelet. But rage is a wasteful energy and a demolition. You don't swing the wrecking ball until the site is cleared. I typed one word. One single, devastatingly simple word. Okay. I hit send. It was the ultimate act of compliance. It was exactly what she wanted. Total submission. I wanted her to feel safe. I wanted her to walk into that community center tomorrow thinking she had won. I wanted her to be at the height of her triumph when the floor fell out from under her. I picked up the phone again and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. Jack, it's Arthur Vance. Arthur? Last time I heard from you, we were vetting a foreman for the stadium project. What's on your mind? Jack was a private investigator, a former detective who specialized in corporate anomalies. He was a man who lived in the details that other people ignored. I need you to document a site for me tomorrow. Jack, Saturday. He was at 11 p.m. The downtown community center. The rec room. Jack's voice sounded skeptical. That's a far cry from the Grandview. Exactly, I said. I need high-resolution photos of the setup, the food, the decorations, and specifically the jewelry worn by Jessica Miller and her mother, Veronica. I want a long lens, Jack. I want to see the hallmarks on the gold, if you can get them. You sound like you're building a case, Arthur. I'm not building a case, Jack. I'm finishing one. And one more thing. I'm bringing the sheriff. My final call was to Frank. Sheriff Frank Miller. We had played poker every Tuesday for 15 years until Mary got sick. We had seen each other through recessions, local scandals, and the slow aging of our bones. He was a man of the law, but more importantly, he was a man of his word. Frank, I said, my voice heavy with a gravity he recognized immediately. I have a structural emergency, but it's not a building. It's a crime. Arthur, talk to me. It's theft by deception, identity fraud, elder abuse, and the suspects are my own blood. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Frank's heavy breathing, the sound of a man weighing his duty against his friendship. You sure about this, Arthur? Once the deputies are involved, there's no taking it back. This isn't a family argument anymore. I know, I said, looking at the manila folder on my table. But they unrang the bell when they tried to steal my name for a $50,000 loan. They unrang the bell when they lied to a 7-year-old boy. Meet me at my house at 1:30 tomorrow, Frank. Bring a cruiser. I'll be there, Frank said. I'm sorry, Arthur. Truly. So am I, Frank. So am I. Saturday arrived with a sky so blue it looked synthetic, like a backdrop for a play. I stood before the mahogany mirror in my bedroom, dressing with the slow, methodical precision of a soldier preparing for a final stand. I chose my best suit, a heavy navy blue wool that hung with the authority of 40 years of success. I buttoned the crisp white shirt, the starch feeling like a second skin. I checked the manila folder one last time. Each document was a structural defect in their lives. The catering invoice for $450, the image of the check endorsed by Jessica, the bank's record of the fraudulent loan inquiry, and the receipt from Lux Jewelers. I tucked the folder under my arm. It felt heavy, not with paper, but with the weight of a family's collapse. I wasn't just a grandfather today. I was the wrecking ball. Frank arrived at exactly 1:30 p.m. The gravel in my driveway crunched under the tires of his cruiser, a sound like grinding bone. He walked into my house, his uniform pressed, his badge gleaming with a cold metallic light. He took the folder from me and spread the documents across the kitchen table. He didn't speak for a long time. He whistled low, a sharp sound in the quiet kitchen. Arthur, he said, looking up with eyes that had seen the worst of this town. This isn't just a family dispute. This is a sequence of felonies. Theft by deception over $5,000. Identity fraud. And if we push it, elder abuse. You're handing me a map to their prison cells. I know exactly what I'm handing you, Frank, I said, my voice sounding like it was being pulled from a deep well. I've spent my life building things to last. But you can't save a building when the primary supports are made of rot. If I let this go, I'm an accomplice to the destruction of my grandson's future. Frank looked at me, searching for a flicker of hesitation. He found none. Once we ring this bell, Arthur, there's no unringing it. The local papers, the school board, they're all going to know. It's going to be a demolition in broad daylight. Good, I said, adjusting my cuffs. I've always preferred working in the light. Let's go. We drove in Frank's cruiser. He didn't use the sirens, but the presence of the black and white car felt like a funeral procession. We passed the turnoff for the Grandview estate, the white pillars visible in the distance like ghosts of the lie. We kept going, descending toward the older, graying part of town. The silence inside the car was pressurized. I watched the neighborhoods I had helped build pass by. The sturdy brick houses, the reliable foundations. I wondered where I had gone wrong with David. I wondered if I had built his life too easily, leaving him without the internal steel needed to resist a woman like Jessica. We pulled up to the downtown community center. It was a squat, utilitarian building of tired red brick, sitting next to a public pool that smelled of over-chlorinated water. It was the kind of place you rented for $20 an hour when you had no other options. As we stepped out of the cruiser, the wind carried the muffled sound of the chicken dance and the high-pitched screams of children. It was a pathetic contrast to the Grandview fantasy they had sold me. I felt a surge of cold, clinical disgust. They had taken my $5,000 and relegated my grandson to a concrete box with linoleum floors. Frank led the way. He didn't knock. He pushed the heavy double doors open, and they hit the interior rubber stoppers with a loud, nasal bang that echoed through the gymnasium. The room went dead silent. The music didn't stop, but the life in the room did. It was a sad sight. Streams of cheap crepe paper hung from the basketball hoops, and several folding tables were covered in grease-stained pizza boxes. In the center of the room, standing under a flickering fluorescent light, was Jessica. She held a crystal wine glass, likely brought from home, and wore a silk dress that cost more than the entire party. Veronica stood next to her, draped in a mink fur coat that looked absurd against the backdrop of a public recreation center. She was holding court with a few bewildered-looking parents from the private academy. "It's a vintage industrial theme," I heard her say just before she saw us. Then the color drained from her face. Jessica's glass tilted in her hand, red wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Fear is a powerful chemical. I could see it vibrating in the air between us. Jessica didn't look like a socialite anymore. She looked like a cornered animal. Jessica's smile didn't just fade. It disintegrated. "Arthur," she squeaked, her voice cracking like a dry reed. "What are you doing here?" I thought I told you my mother was... You told me a lot of things, Jessica," I said, stepping into the center of the room. My voice was calm, but it carried to every corner of the gym. "But I'm a builder. I have a habit of checking the site for myself." The guests, neighbors, school board members, people they were trying so desperately to impress, began to murmur. They looked at the two uniformed officers standing behind me, and then at the pizza boxes on the tables. Frank stepped forward, his thumbs tucked into his duty belt, his expression unreadable. "Jessica Miller, yes?" she whispered, her hand going to her throat. "I am here representing the interests of Arthur Vance. We are investigating a series of financial discrepancies related to the funding of this event." "Discrepancies?" she laughed, a high, hysterical sound. "It's a birthday party. Is he sick? Arthur, are you having an episode?" "I've never been clearer," I said. Frank pulled the first sheet from the folder. "We have a confirmed statement from the Grandview estate. No booking was ever made. We have the invoice for this hall. $50 for the afternoon. We have the catering receipt from Elite Eats. $450. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hallway. I watched Jessica's eyes dart toward the exit. "Where is the other $4,500, Jessica?" I asked. "The money I gave you for Leo's future?" Jessica gripped her right wrist, her fingers instinctively trying to hide the diamond tennis bracelet that sparkled under the harsh gym light. "We also have a receipt from Lux Jewelers," Frank continued, his voice dropping into a professional monotone. "A diamond bracelet, $4,000, Purchased 48 hours after a $5,000 check was deposited into a private, undisclosed account. A collective gasp went through the room. One of the mothers from the academy stepped back, her face a mask of horror. The visual architecture Jessica had worked so hard to build was collapsing in real time. "That's a lie," Jessica shrieked, her voice echoing off the concrete wall. "It was a gift. He gave me that money for whatever I wanted." "Arthur, tell them. I also have the records of a loan application," I said, my voice cutting through her panic. "A $50,000 loan for senior care. You tried to use my credit, Jessica. You tried to borrow against my life while I was still living it." She looked like she had been slapped. Veronica, beside her, looked like she was about to faint, her hand clutching the back of a plastic chair for support. Frank turned his gaze toward the corner of the room. David was standing there, holding a stack of paper plates. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. "David Miller," Frank called out. "I'm here," David whispered, dropping the plates. They scattered across the floor like oversized confetti. "You are being served with a formal notice of eviction for the property at 42 Elm Street," Frank said, stepping toward him with a legal envelope. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises." "Eviction?" David stammered, looking at me with eyes full of a pathetic, watery desperation. "Dad, you're throwing us on the street? Because of a party?" "Not because of a party, David," I said, and for the first time, my voice shook with the weight of my grief. "Because you sat at my table and ate my food while you lied to my face. You knew the grand view was a lie. You knew about the money. You chose the bracelet over your father, and you chose the lie over your son." David flinched as if I'd struck him. "I didn't know about the jewelry. I swear, Dad. I thought she was paying off the renovations." "There are no renovations, David," I yelled, the sound of my own voice surprising me. "There is only rot, and you let it in. Remove the bracelet, ma'am," Frank ordered, turning back to Jessica. "What? No, this is mine. It is evidence in a felony theft investigation," Frank said, his hand resting near his holster, not as a threat, but as a reminder of the power he held. "Remove it now, or I will have the deputy assist you, and we will do this at the station in front of everyone." Jessica's hands shook so violently she couldn't work the clasp. She fumbled with the gold, her breath coming in ragged, ugly gasps. Finally, the deputy stepped forward. With a clinical cold efficiency, he unhooked the diamonds and dropped them into a plastic evidence bag. The clink of the stones against the plastic sounded like the end of the world. "Am I being arrested?" Jessica whispered, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Charges are being filed," Frank said. "Theft, by deception, identity fraud. We have enough for a warrant, right now, but for the sake of the children in this room, we're going to let you walk out of here. You have 1 hour to report to the precinct for processing. If you aren't there, we come to the house with the sirens on. Do you understand?" Jessica didn't answer. She just turned and ran toward the exit, her heels clicking frantically on the linoleum. Veronica followed, trying to pull her fur coat around her like a shield, but she just looked small and broken. The room began to clear. Parents grabbed their children's hands and moved toward the doors, their whispers sounding like the rustle of dry leaves. Nobody looked at David. Nobody looked at the cake. David stood in the center of the gym, surrounded by the wreckage of his wife's ambition. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. The structure had collapsed, and the dust was still settling. I didn't look at my son. I looked for Leo. I found him sitting by the cake table, his legs dangling from a chair that was too big for him. He was wearing a paper party hat that had wilted in the heat. He looked confused, his hazel eyes wide with a question he didn't know how to ask. I walked over to him, my heavy boots sounding like thunder on the gym floor. I knelt down, ignoring the sharp protest of my bad knee. At that moment, the 60 years between us felt like nothing. "Pop, Pop?" he asked, his voice small and trembling. "Why did Mommy run away? Why are the police here?" "To fix a bad rule, buddy," I said, reaching out to straighten his hat. "Sometimes people forget how to build things the right way, and when that happens, the police have to come and help us start over." "Did I do something wrong?" "No, Leo, you did everything right. Did you get any of that cake yet?" No. Mommy said we had to wait for the important people to arrive. Well, I said, standing up and taking his small, sticky hand in mine. I think the important people are already here. Come on, I said, leading him toward the door. I have a pizza oven at home that makes way better slices than these. And I have a very large, very complicated surprise waiting for you in the garage. It's from a galaxy far, far away. The Death Star? He gasped, his face finally lighting up with a spark of the old joy. The Death Star, I confirmed. And this time, we're going to build it together. Every single brick. We walked out of the community center and into the bright, honest sunlight. Behind us, the gym was empty, a hollow shell of a light. Ahead of us was the long road home, and the slow, difficult work of rebuilding a life from the ground up. I led Leo out of that hollow, echoing gymnasium. His small hand swallowed by my own, I could feel the slight tremor in his fingers, a vibration of confusion that traveled up my arm and settled in my chest. Behind us, the party was a ghost town. Abandoned pizza crust, deflated balloons, and the wreckage of a social climb that had ended in a sheer drop. We reached the truck, the Ford's familiar boxy shape, a comfort in the dizzying aftermath. I lifted Leo into the passenger seat, buckling him in with the same care I used when securing a heavy load for transport. I didn't look back at the community center doors, but I knew David was there. I could hear his footsteps shuffling, heavy, the sound of a man whose center of gravity had been permanently displaced. "Dad," David's voice called out as I walked around to the driver's side. It was a broken sound, stripped of the rehearsed confidence he'd worn for months. I stopped with my hand on the door handle. I didn't turn around, I couldn't. If I looked at him then, I might have seen the boy I used to take fishing, and my resolve might have softened like wet clay. I needed to be stunned. "Get in your car, David," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a finality that brooked no argument. "Follow me. Bring Leo's things. We're going to my house. Alone." "Is Jessica?" "Don't say her name," I cut him off. "Just drive." The drive home was a funeral procession for 3 generations. In the passenger seat, Leo leaned his head against the window, watching the streetlights flicker to life. He didn't ask about the police again. Children are experts at sensing when the air in a room or a car has become too heavy to breathe. In the rearview mirror, David's headlights followed me like twin eyes of a haunting. He stayed exactly 3 car lengths back, never closer, never further. It was the most obedient he'd been in years. By the time we pulled into my driveway, the sun had vanished, leaving a bruise-colored sky that felt appropriate for the work ahead. I didn't take them into the house first. I took Leo straight to the garage. I flipped at the industrial switches, and the fluorescent tubes hummed to life, bathing the workshop in a cold, honest light. The smell of cedar and oil acted like a balm on my frayed nerves. "Go on, buddy," I said, nodding toward the workbench where the massive Lego box sat, still wrapped in the blueprint vellum. "It's yours. Start on the foundation. Use the manual. I need to talk to your father in the kitchen." Leo's joy was a sharp, piercing contrast to the gloom. He tore into the paper with a ferocity that only a 7-year-old can muster. As the first bags of gray plastic bricks spilled onto the wood, I turned to David. We walked into the kitchen, the room still smelling faintly of the pot roast from Thursday. David didn't. He stood by the counter, his arms hanging limp at his sides as if the muscles had been severed. Then the sound started. It wasn't a cry at first, it was a wheeze. The sound of air escaping a punctured lung. He slumped into a chair, his head falling into his hands, and then the sobs came. They were ugly, deep-chested heaves that shook his entire frame. It was the sound of a structure finally surrendering to the load. It was the sound of a man realizing he had traded his soul for a diamond bracelet and a lie. I let him cry. I didn't offer a tissue. I didn't put a hand on his shoulder. In construction, when a wall falls, you don't try to catch it. You let it hit the ground so you can see what's left of the rubble. I stood by the stove, watching the clock tick. 5 minutes. 10. Ugly, racking sobs. The sound of a man who realized he had lost himself in the fog of someone else's vanity. I remembered him as a toddler crying over a scraped knee. Back then I could fix it with a bandage and a hug. But this wound was internal. This was a fracture in the character. Tears don't wash away sins, but they can start the cleaning of the site. When the sobs finally tapered off into ragged, wet gasps, I pulled out a chair and sat opposite him. I didn't look at him with anger. I looked at him with the cold, clinical eyes of a man deciding whether to condemn a building or attempt a massive renovation. "Here is the deal, David," I said. My voice was iron. "I am going to lay out the specs for the rest of your life. There is no negotiation. There are no adjustments. You follow the blueprint, or the demolition continues until there is nothing left of your name." David looked up, his eyes bloodshot and swollen, his face a mask of shame. He nodded, once, a jerky motion of a puppet whose strings had been cut. "First," I said, holding up a finger, "the divorce. You file on Monday. Irreconcilable differences. Or better yet, the truth. If you hesitate, if you listen to one more word of her optics or her mother's fragility, I will personally hand the sheriff the evidence of the identity fraud. I will ensure she goes to a state prison for 5 to 10. You choose your son's mother in a cage or out of your life." David flinched, but he didn't look away. "I'm done, Dad." I saw her face when they took the bracelet. She didn't care about Leo. She didn't even care about me. She just cared about the stones. "Second," I continued, "you move out of Elm Street. I'm selling that property. You get a small apartment, something you can afford on a laborer's wage, because you're going to work, real work. My company needs a site clearance crew. You start on Monday at 6 or 8. Third," I said, leaning forward until I could see my own reflection in his tear-filled eyes, "you pay me back every single cent of that $5,000. Plus the legal fees Robert is going to rack up. You will live on bread and water until that ledger is balanced. Honor isn't something you're born with, David. It's something you buy back with sweat." "I will," he whispered. "I'll pay it all. And fourth," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating whisper, "the boy. You protect Leo. If you let that woman or her mother within 100 yards of him, without a court-ordered supervisor, I will not hesitate. I will use every dollar I have left to take full custody of him. I will not have his foundation rotted by their greed." David looked at me, and for the first time in a decade, I saw something honest in him. It wasn't just guilt. It was a profound, bone-deep fear. But it was a healthy fear, the kind a man has when he realizes he's standing on the edge of a canyon. "I promise, Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't take him from me. He's all I have left that's real." I watched him for a long beat. I checked the level. I checked the plumb line. I believed him, not because of his words, but because of the way he looked at his own hands, seeing the emptiness there for the first time. The foundation was cracked, but the soil was finally beginning to settle. 6 months had passed since the hammer fell on the life David and Jessica had built on a swamp of lies. It was a crisp Sunday morning, the kind of day where the air smells of wet earth and the promise of something coming to life. The garage, once a place of solitary mourning for my Mary, had been transformed. The industrial lights were on, but they didn't feel cold anymore. The air was thick with the scent of pine sawdust, and the rhythmic, comforting scritch-scritch of sandpaper against wood. Leo and I were at the main workbench. The balsa wood planes were finished, hanging from the rafters like a tiny, silent air force. Now, we were on the final stage of the project that had seen us through the darkest winter of our lives, the Death Star. It stood in the center of the bench, a massive, intricate sphere of gray plastic, a monument to patience and following the instructions. "Hand me the glue for the laser array, Pop-Pop," Leo said, his voice steady. He didn't look like the wilting child in the paper party hat anymore. His shoulders were broader, his hazel eyes clear and focused. He handled the small plastic pieces with a reverence for the assembly process that I hadn't seen in men 3 times his age. I handed him the tube, watching the way he applied just the right amount of pressure. He understood now that if you rush the small parts, the whole structure suffers. We had spent hundreds of hours in this garage talking about more than just plastic bricks. We talked about honesty. We talked about why some houses stand for a century while others wash away in the first storm. He was learning to be a builder. The heavy side door of the garage creaked open, admitting a slice of bright morning sun. A figure stood in the silhouette, framed by the light. David walked in. He wasn't the soft man in the polished loafers who had twisted his ring in my kitchen 6 months ago. He was wearing heavy work boots caked with the red clay of the new library site. His jeans were faded at the knees, and his flannel shirt, a gift from my own closet, was damp with the sweat of a man who had been up since 5 hours in the a.m. He moved with a new kind of gravity, a physical heaviness that suggested he finally knew where his feet met the ground. He didn't look tired, he looked tempered. David walked over to the workbench, nodding to Leo, who gave him a quick, proud thumb up. David then looked at me. He didn't look away this time. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, slightly crumpled piece of paper. "Hey, Dad," he said. His voice had lost its frantic edge. It was lower now, grounded. "Here, for the week." He handed me a check for $2. It was his weekly payment, the restitution tax we had agreed upon. I took it, the paper feeling heavy in my hand. I didn't need the money. I had plenty in the bank, but I put it in my pocket nonetheless. So David. That paper wasn't a debt. It was his dignity, bought back 1 hour of manual labor at a time. It was the sound of a foundation being reinforced, brick by painful brick. "Jessica called again last night," David said, picking up a sanding block and mindlessly smoothing a scrap piece of oak. He spoke the name without the old tremor of fear or the desperate need to please. He spoke it like a weather report, something to be noted and prepared for, but nothing that could change his course. I paused, my hand resting on a plastic strut. "Is it her court-mandated weekend?" "No," David said, his jaw tightening slightly. "She wanted to take him to some exclusive brunch. Said her mother found a new social circle and wanted to show off the grandson. Said it would be good for his development to be around successful people again." "And what did you tell her?" I asked. I felt the old tension rise in my neck, but I kept my hands still. David stopped sanding. He looked at Leo, who was happily snapping the final laser turret into place, oblivious to the ghosts of his parents' mistakes. Then David looked back at me. "I told her no," David said. "I told her that Leo was busy building something real. I told her to stop asking for things she hasn't earned. I told her that if she wants to see him, she can meet us at the park on our scheduled day, in a t-shirt with no cameras and no optics." She hung up on me. I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth, a real deep-seated pride that I hadn't felt for my son in a decade. "Good," I said. "Now, grab some 2020 grit. This base plate isn't going to smooth itself." We stood there for the next hour, 3 generations of Vance men. There were no diamonds here. There was no social standing or visual architecture. There were no fur coats or mid-Atlantic accents. There was only the smell of sawdust, the weight of the tools, and the uncomfortable, beautiful truth of hard work. I watched David show Leo how to check a corner for squareness. I saw the way Leo listened, his hazel eyes absorbing the lesson like a sponge. We were building a Death Star, yes, but we were also rebuilding a family. We were creating a structure that didn't rely on the approval of strangers or the balance of a credit card. We were building something load-bearing. I looked down at my hand. They were older now, the liver spots more pronounced, the arthritis a dull hum in my knuckles. They were scarred, rough, and permanently stained with the work of 40 years. To Jessica and Veronica, these hands were a disgrace, a sign of a life spent in the dirt. But as I looked at David's hands, now starting to develop the same thick calluses, the same nicks from stray nails, I realized that these hands were my greatest achievement. I had fixed the foundation that had cost me $5,000 in cash, a few months of my life and a heart that had to be broken before it could be reset. But looking at the two of them, I knew it was the best investment Vance & Sons had ever made. The house on Elm Street was sold. The debt was being paid. The lies had been cleared away like debris after a storm. I realized then that my life as a builder had taught me everything I needed to know about being a father. You can't just paint over the rot. You can't ignore the cracks in the basement and hope the roof stays up. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is be the one who calls for the demolition. You have to be brave enough to tear it all down. The pride, the fake smiles, the toxic loyalty, to find the solid ground beneath. Only then can you start the slow, honest work of building something that will actually stand. It's done. Pop, pop. Leo shouted, throwing his hands in the air. The Death Star was complete. It sat on the bench, a perfect, complex sphere. It was beautiful, not because of what it was, but because of how it got there. It was built with patience. It was built with truth. I looked at my son, and for the first time in years, I saw my own reflection in his eyes. Not the disappointment, but the strength. The house was strong again. The loads were distributed. The wind could howl all it wanted. This family wasn't going anywhere. As we turned off the garage lights and walked toward the house for Sunday dinner, I felt a profound sense of peace. I am Arthur. I build things. And today, I finally finished the most important project in my life. Sometimes you have to tear it all down to build it right, but when you do, you make sure you use the best materials: wood, glue, and the truth. The story of Arthur, David, and Leo is a powerful reminder that the strongest structures aren't made of stone, but of the integrity we show when the world is watching, and when it isn't. If you found yourself rooting for Arthur's strength, or removed by David's journey back to the truth, consider staying with us. These stories of human depth, resilience, and the grit it takes to protect what matters are what we live for. We'd be honored to have you as part of our community. Please like and subscribe to join us for the next build.